Hello and welcome to Filmfest München 2021. My name is Julia Weigl. I'm a programmer with the festival, and today we will be talking about the topic homelessness. And I have invited a few guests digitally for this talk. They will be Logan George and Celine Held, the directors of Topside, which will be screening at the festival, and the curator Talesnik of the Architekturmuseum Munich. And this talk is a collaboration between the Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism, the Amerikahaus, and the Architekturmuseum Munich. Welcome to a panel on homelessness in different cities, and especially homelessness in New York. Because we at FILMFEST München have a very special film in our program called Topside, and we have the two directors here with us digitally, Celine Held and Logan George. Hi Celine, hi Logan.
Hi Julia.
Thanks so much for joining us from New York. How are you today?
It's early here, but we really wish we were in Germany, and it was in the afternoon. We can only imagine. We're doing well. We're so honored to be presenting our film at your festival.
Yeah. And so great that you're taking the time again to talk to us a little longer this time, actually about the topic homelessness, which is the topic of your film. And we have another special guest from Munich. Well, he's based in Munich. He's a curator with the Architectural Museum here in Munich, Talesnik. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're joining us today on this specific topic.
I'm a curator at the Architekturmuseum der Turm, which is located in the Pinakothek del Moderne from Munich. And I'm curating an exhibition that will open in November 4th of this year, and it will be open until February 6th of 2022. That has the title, Who's Next? Homelessness, Architecture, and Cities. And one of the cities that we are studying for the exhibition is New York. So this film is particularly relevant for our topic, and hopefully I can contribute to the conversation.
I'm pretty sure you can. So maybe let's get started, because what we will also be talking about is mainly like creative approaches to the topic of homelessness. And maybe let's get started with Topside, the film that we will be screening here at the festival. Celine and Logan, maybe you can give us an idea, what is the film about and what was your approach to this specific topic and the film itself?
Yeah, well, the story follows a mother and her daughter, and they're living in a tunnel, beneath New York City, with dozens of other people. They're part of a small community down there, and the story really kicks off when they're being evicted by the city and being sort of thrust up into the city itself on a very cold winter night. And it's about their sort of like struggle to stay together and to find new shelter.
As far as our kind of approach, we have never ourselves experienced homelessness. And so I was first introduced to families that were living below the poverty line in New York City through teaching at a kindergarten. And I told the story to you last time, Julia. But I had some run-ins with Child Protective Services, which is called ACS here in New York. And so essentially it felt like this very invisible problem that so many people were actually homeless or living in shelters or in supportive housing networks. But what we see and what we believe is homelessness is street homelessness. And so it felt like there was just a disconnect as far as like how many children are actually homeless, or what is this stigma we're putting on this word when it's actually a reality for so many people. So we started by our research. We did a documentary on street homelessness, and where we interviewed a lot of people, but we made it down into 50 stories where we edited it down into these individual moments, these little tidbits, these stories of people who were currently living on the streets. And then we made a documentary also on shelter homelessness with 3 mothers and their children, following them from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to work or school. And, we learned a lot. Our story changed significantly in that research. So that's kind of where we came with our approach.
Daniel, your reaction to the film, because you have seen the film already, like maybe you can tell us a little like what you saw and experienced when you watched Topside.
Right. Unfortunately, I couldn't watch it in a movie theater, but that was one of my thoughts as I watched the film, because I could imagine how immersive or how it's a very powerful film on the one hand, but also it's very claustrophobic to watch. You really follow the experience of this mother and her child as they first move through the tunnels, and then when they go topside, to use the title of your film. And it's a very close experience to their horizons, to the way they look at the city, to the way they look at things. So that's one thing. The other thing is the amount of added topics that it unfolds, right? It's not only, this woman is not only experiencing homelessness, there's also addiction, prostitution, so on and so forth. So the story in itself is very strong, it's very powerful. And the point of view of the child stands out as something quite unique of how you filmed and what you filmed. Then my last reaction, I couldn't, I know the statistics of homelessness and houselessness in New York, of course, and we could talk about that and how many children are experiencing it and going to school at the same time. But from my point of view, what was extremely interesting and different perhaps about your film was how you filmed in the infrastructure of New York, starting with the subway, of course, but also there's a terminal at some point, there's a church interior, where do they go to the bathroom when they need to wash themselves? And the film unfolds in these public places. And that for me was what it captured my attention.
Fantastic. Celine Logan, would you like to react to that reaction of Daniel?
Yeah, well, you know, it was ultimately like a feeling that we were trying to cultivate, you know, throughout, you know, the experience of watching it. We wanted to bring the audience member as close to that sensation of, it's really a desperation, you know, when you have to move from space to space, you don't have that grounding of a home somewhere where you can feel safe and you can do something as simple as, yeah, like wash yourself and feel protected from the elements. So it was very important to us that we were, you know, keeping the pace and the energy of moving from scene to scene and having the audience, you know, move along in that journey, never feeling that they could rest, take a breath. So part of that, yeah, like, you know, 100% factored into the way that we filmed it, and using very, very tight lenses most of the time, staying in like a 50 millimeter world, because we never wanted you to feel sort of safe and like I can understand everything that's going on in this moment because I'm seeing the entire scene unfold in a wide. It was always about sort of keeping things through their perspective, never giving away too much information. And like you said, Daniel, like that was sort of our way in always, because we knew the story was so brutal and was, you know, going to be very intense, was, you know, putting it through the lens of the child, always having it, you know, from her perspective as often as possible, was kind of the way into the story.
Something that Daniel also mentioned was immersiveness, like being immersed in that world that you created. And then another thing to almost go one step further is like, it has a very documentary aspect to it. Did you ever think about like actually turning it into a documentary?
Well, I think that there's it's a complicated question, because I think that homelessness itself, and it's something that is a strange thing to talk about, but like the issue of homelessness itself is like not a sexy topic. There's nothing about it that we can like attach ourselves to and say like, we were listening just to this podcast the other day where they were talking about this exact thing, where they were saying, you know, gay rights can be a sexy topic. It's something we can get behind. It's something we can all like rally and say like, yes, and this is, it's beautiful. But poverty and homelessness is not that. It is finding somewhere to wash yourself. It is, you know, not having a home base, and the mere idea of not having someone to call is sometimes unfathomable to those of us who do have people to call. But you know, so I think that we wanted to make it cinematic. In making it a documentary, you put it on this level where it's like, as a viewer, maybe I can almost shut off.
And it's about the information, you know, that you're relaying, and I think that was something that always, it was like there was an opportunity in being able to, you know, have like a visceral connection to the story and not be, you know, so separated from it, you know, like getting, you know, the facts. So the story of Topside is a fiction, but it's sort of, you know, like pulled from all these different people that we talked to.
But it's always been important to us that it is not a story that should stand for other stories. Yeah. You know, it touches on these other topics, but it is a fiction. In this particular tunnel that we portray in our in the film, that tunnel people stopped living in. The last person to move out was in 2004, and before that, the big exodus was like in the early 90s. So it's been a very long time for this particular tunnel. There's some tunnels under Central Park that there's whispers that people still live there. But ultimately, it is, to be frank, it's a talk about architecture, a talk about spaces, a talk about like how you can define, you know, there's another story on homelessness that I read many years ago now about this man who was living on the street in New York who drew chalk lines around pieces of sidewalk and wrote living room and then bedroom. And then there's something so like, you know, you come upon that in New York and you walk around all of a sudden, like that has been a defined space. And so, you know, it is a talk about like, for shelters, for supportive housing, there you have a sign-in time, you have a sign-out time. You cannot go over curfew. You cannot, you know, and so anyway, basically to make it a documentary would be something where there were so much red tape, so much finding someone who would be open to this, and the sexy element, like the cinematic element. To film in a tunnel, to film in an entirely new environment that we haven't seen in film before, felt like an opportunity, and it felt next to impossible to find in a documentary format.
Daniel, would you like to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I would like to comment on the style of filming. I think that's something that you manage to communicate through the urgency of their search for safety or privacy, however you want to call it. I don't want to impose a word. You communicate the urgency of the larger topic. And I think that that's extremely relevant, that by having this experience with the character and her daughter, you understand how urgent this topic is, particularly in cities like New York. I'm also interested in this topic of visibility and visibility that you've commented, and how some very private activities like raising a child, which is something that we're looking at in our exhibition through the essay of a contributor, is something that some people experiencing homelessness have to do in front of others, in plain sight, if you will. And that's something that's very relevant in your film. She's looking around, she's trying to tell something important to her daughter, but has to keep an eye at the security guards. There's always this tension between what she has to do as a mother and what she has to control in this environment that has not the tunnel, but when they're up in the city, environments that their limits are not so clear, if you will.
Yeah, it was something else that we wanted to really communicate, was that, you know, there's no villains in the world that are out necessarily to like really harm her, that there's actually, you know, there are support networks, and the security officials that she does run into, you know, like they're actually like, they, you know, some other world, maybe they could have helped her if she was a little more open, but
her child's being taken away no matter what.
Yeah.
Like that's the bottom line, is that no matter how those people are trying to do their jobs, she is an addict, she is raising a child in a tunnel. Those things are not,
they're illegal in New York,
not
okay,
and
in many places.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's the whole thing, is like we wanted to make it this thing where there's a lot of gray area. Like if she was more open in the church, for example, like maybe there was an opportunity if she was more open.
But communicating that distrust that I think so many people who you know, who have been broken by a system a little bit, you know, or sort of like pulled through the ringer a little bit. There's like a very inherent distrust that we had to break down, you know, in talking to a lot of people ourselves. There was a guy named Dre who we spoke to, said something that like really struck us just about this like idea of private versus public space. He's like, you know, at the end of the day, sometimes for me, like I just want to have a drink. And he's like, and so do you. And like, so do so many people. And like, we all get to go do that in the comfort of our own home, go drink in private, and it's not a big deal. But I'm sort of, judged for having a drink, just because I'm out on a stoop, or out on the street. And it's true, like the way that you sort of like can judge that, but it's only because he doesn't have a private space to be able to do that.
But it's also how he spends his money, and which is a huge thing with giving money to street homelessness in New York. It's very, people say, don't do it. And it's like, well, who are we to say how they spend their money?
Yeah.
Who are we to say, to a street homeless, someone who's currently experiencing homelessness on the street, you cannot go buy a beer with this. I'm going to take you to this deli and buy you a sandwich.
Or whatever, yeah.
It's like, but there's a line where you're like, well, you should be applying for jobs. And it's like, in street homelessness especially, there is definitely a mental health aspect that is huge in New York and I'm sure in Germany too. And there's, that has to factor in. We can't ignore these things that we're expecting people to come to our level of what it means to be a member of society, like a contributing member of society. And they're literally have no place to wash themselves. So like, how can we expect, like, where is that gap? Where does that go?
Absolutely. A little bit to maybe sum it up is like, where does privacy start and where does it end in a way? It's like, it's a very fluid space when you don't really have a home where you can close your door.
Oh yeah, and that's why, the images from the tunnel community that lived in the Freedom Tunnel between the 80s and the 90s are so compelling and so beautiful. There's a book, Daniel, I'm sure maybe you have it, but you should totally get it if you don't. It's called The Tunnel by Margaret Morton. And you look in these pages in the interior of their houses, and it looks like it could be my grandmother's house, like teddy bears everywhere and like calendars, and they've made it so beautiful. And in a shelter, sometimes you can't put things on the wall. Especially if you're going into a shelter as a single adult, you're in a dormitory with bunk beds everywhere, with the guy over there who has huge mental health issues and is screaming half the night. And it's like, as that person, I would rather be in the tunnel, making my own home, pulling electricity from up above. And so I think, and that's who we were out to represent with John, and with even the guy who has the dogs, or the woman who's reading her the book. Like these people who have created their own spaces where it's actually like very, like John's house, super set up, super, he's like really has it all together. He's got like a little pan for cooking.
Yeah, it's something that Margaret Morton commented on, was how clean they kept their spaces and how much of a community they'd really built. And it's something that's not possible in New York now. That's was also so striking to us was, it's a story, that we modernize, but the type of community, honestly, like could not exist in New York the way that the city polices spaces these days. It's become much more, it was just like more amorphous, and there were, abandoned sections of the city that people could overtake. But, into these later years, there's been a real crackdown on being able to, build any kind of encampment.
The recent thing with the hotel on the Upper West Side, maybe you've heard about 8,000 members of the homeless community housed there and now kicked out. A park in LA, same story, big protest where the homeless had taken over this park, and then LA residents wanted them out, which, to be fair, there were break-ins around, and needles around this park. And so there's this line where it's not all rainbows and butterflies. Like, we can't just, wish away this problem. I think in our country, especially, mental health is not talked about. It is not. I think Nikki in our story has huge mental health problems. I think she's bipolar. I think there's a lot of like things that are happening in that community, in those people, the story that we told, that we didn't explore because, you can only put so much into one. You can only pack it so full. But I think in our country, in Washington State, they did an experiment where they gave houses just to all the homeless. They just gave housing, and it worked. And it really, really worked. And now they have such a small homeless population, and they just continually give away housing. And that's how it works there. And so it's just, I don't know, I think that we, you know, on one side, we need to be more giving and more forgiving and more compassionate, more empathetic. But on the other side, you know, we still need to have like otherwise we can't have laws. We need to have like some black and white ability.
Absolutely. Maybe before we delve a little more into the now and what the situation is maybe like right now and what a film like yours can do, I would like to ask Daniel, like, what is it that interests you in this specific topic with your sort of like exhibition as well? And also, like, one thing that Celine and Logan mentioned is the aesthetics of homelessness and how it used to be portrayed and now is portrayed. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit from your view and perspective as a curator as well.
Here in the museum, there is an interest in understanding the social impact of architecture, of design. And there's been a series of exhibitions that from one point or another address this larger topic. But experiencing homelessness or homelessness period is not really a topic that can be solved only by design or architecture. It can contribute and can collaborate, but it's more of it's a more complex problem that needs more actors and social services and in institutions and an organization. In a city like New York, actually, we think it's not a money problem, because if you see the statistics or the numbers of how much the city spends on each person that's experiencing homelessness when they go into the system, there are resources, but there are other things that need to come into play. That's one thing. And something to be said about your film is that you don't try to summarize all of the problems, but you exit the film or when you finish the film, you have an impression of what experiencing homelessness can be. It's not the only possible situation around the topic, but it's one version of it. And that has to do a little bit with the problem of doing an exhibition on this. How do you unfold or break it down into as many problems as necessary that need to be explained so that the public that come to see the exhibition can leave the exhibition with an understanding of what are the problems around homelessness and homelessness proper. Then, of course, there are attempts and different, let's call them theories to address the problem. There's a problem coming from the Nordic country called Housing First, that in a way says what you said before, Celine, that whatever happens, people that are experiencing homelessness have to be housed first, and then things will fall into place. And the example that you gave of shelters has to do with this idea, because if you're in a shelter, you have to leave for the day. You can only come back to sleep. That means that you have a problem with your personal things. Where do you spend the day, loitering, so on and so forth. Then in cities like New York, we have the affordable housing programs, right? But when you see the amount of people that have applied to them, you understand that something like that, at least until today, will not address the problem in all of its magnitude. And then there's design itself. What do you design and for whom, right? And that's what we're trying to see in the exhibition too. Through case studies, understand what can architecture design do from the point of view of examples in Los Angeles, for instance. Michael Maltzan has worked for the Skid Row Housing Trust, and through the process of designing buildings, he's discovered that washing machines should be in every floor, not in the basement. And that has to do with mental health issues of some of the people living there, that they don't want to take the elevator or they think they could have a breakdown. That's one example, and a good one in the United States, of an architect that has been very involved in trying to contribute to the problem from the standpoint of design. Then the last part of your comment, I would name it the production of domestic space in the streets. And that's kind of a different topic. It's when you encounter people that are living in the streets and how they arrange their lives in plain sight. And we're addressing it through a documentary film, actually, that will take place in Sao Paulo, Brazil, during this period of pandemic. And Freya Frese, who's a sociologist, has been working throughout the pandemic in trying to understand precisely this, but with a more academic outlook, right? And what you were saying of the living room, the kitchen space, how is this happening in sidewalks, to be precise, today in cities around the world, specifically in Sao Paulo in this case. So it's not an exhibition that has a one-liner or a research that can give you one conclusion that you will come out with and say, I understood, or now I can contribute to solving or being more empathic with this problem. But it actually has to unfold so many different problematics that people will have different understandings, but at least understanding how complex it is.
It's like an onion. Every single problem, there's a new problem. And you try to say, like, for example, in a shelter that we dealt with a family, and we're still super close to this family. They were living in a shelter in Brooklyn, no Wi-Fi, no washers, dryers, right. And it's like, okay, during the pandemic, no Wi-Fi. The school that is closest to this shelter, it's a ridiculous statistic, like 70% of the children that attend the school live in shelters in the area. This school, in and of itself, has no walls. And so I've been working with this school to try to get a charity to donate the money to build walls.
Well, they have dividers, to separate the classrooms. These just like giant stacks of shelves.
It's not,
it's like porous. You can hear.
It's like boxes, like see-through boxes that they built. It's not even
this
like wall dividers.
A public school, but you compare that public school in that neighborhood to a public school in the West Village or whatever.
These children, exactly.
Yeah.
These children are going from living in one room, 5 kids, 2 parents in a shelter, to a school that has no walls. So it's like this thing where it's just this office building that they've repurposed into a school. So I think we look at all of these things and we're like, oh, this is a solution, the Affordable Care Act, the waiver, and then it's like the waiting list is this long.
Yeah.
And then even if you get a waiver, we know a family who got a waiver for a house, the landlord is trying to trick them out of so much money, because you get landlords who sign up for this waiver program who want to make money off of these homeless families that are living there. And so you can't, there's no like quantifiable thing of like, oh, that will solve it, I feel, until you just start giving away housing.
But what you said, Daniel, as far as like it not being a money problem in New York, it's very, very true. Because the city spends a lot of money on homelessness, but it's all sort of it's not in a preventive fashion. It's sort of like healthcare.
It's superficial, yeah.
Well, it's like the homeless person who's been out on the street and has hypothermia and goes into the hospital costs the city a whole lot to take care of that person, and it would have cost a fraction of that to have just housed him or her in the first place. So we're spending a lot of money, but it's at the tail end, when the damage has already been done and people are struggling that much more with. I think it's about a third of homeless people in New York are struggling with some kind of mental issue, but it means that the predominant, like 2/3, maybe one of the fundamental problems is just affordable housing, and if we could put money sort of in that vein, from the get-go, people would be able to have their own private spaces to be able to like work and build a life off from, as opposed to sort of dealing with homelessness, when the problem's already manifested and grown so big.
And I think we're coming out in the United States in particular out of a political period where at least the presidential discourse was almost you're poor and it's your fault.
Yeah. I mean,
which that's what an exhibition or a film or can completely revert that point of view. It's a systemic problem. You're not choosing to live in the streets necessarily, so on and so forth, right? There's a documentary from 1986 that we will show 15 minutes of in the exhibition called Down and Out in America from Lee Grant. And she films in Los Angeles. She films in rural America first. We won't consider that part, but then she splits the rest of the film between New York and Los Angeles. In a hotel that I think was administrated by the Coalition for the Homeless, and then in Los Angeles in a tent city. And this is 1986. It's basically the same problem we're living today. It's just that today it has exponentially grown. in terms of the number of people in those situations, but it's not different.
Right.
And that is striking when you see, and I'm sure we will find what has been done that made the problem better or worse. But when you see the documentary, it doesn't feel that it was filmed in 1986. It could have been filmed yesterday. And the Coalition for the Homeless is still active.
Right.
And has way more notion of what type of issues they are dealing with and trying to I don't want to use the word solve, but contribute to make better. Los Angeles, San Francisco, you mentioned Seattle, Washington.
Yeah.
The numbers are striking in the United States.
Yeah. No, it's frightening. And you think of cities, when you talk about this problem with people who don't quite understand it as much, and they're like, well, why don't people just move? And so if there's jobs are in cities. That's where they exist.
Right.
So your whole life is in it. That's all you know. So you're just going to abandon everything, like while you're homeless, to try to find somewhere to live in rural Pennsylvania.
No, going back to your film, you touch upon a lot of these things in little moments of the film. When the father tells her to send her to school, you just need to make an address, and that's a piece of paper invented. Yeah. Just send her to school. This is one of the multiple dramas that we are trying to address. If you don't have an address, how can you apply for a job? If you don't have an address, how can you apply for wealth?
Yes. How can
a child be sent to school? There are institutions that provide you an address. You can't even vote if you don't have an address. It's a problem or a situation in multiple scales. So you can't even represent yourself. And then to say something else that might be relevant, it's not a group in society where you find a self-representation, because maybe you don't want to be recognized as being homeless forever. This is not something that defines you, right?
Yes.
You would think that it's a transitory thing. Of course, there is chronic homelessness and a series of categories that are used to subdivide things. But unlike other things, like what you mentioned, it's not a fraction of society that self-represents itself to get more rights, or it's not necessarily the case. There are cases, but that's so. Are they advocating for themselves, or do we have to stand up as a society and advocate for them? And that's something that your film, I think, also, it doesn't say it directly, but I think it's implied.
It's that invisibility factor, which is something much more, when you talk about, kids who, I think, there's plenty of people that haven't quite thought through the idea that there's, literally hundreds of thousands of kids that go through the New York public school system who are homeless for some period, like you're saying. Maybe it's only a couple of months in the school year. Right. In itself can be such a trauma, just that uprooting, even for a short period of time, to be homeless. And then to be chronically homeless is a very, very different thing.
Like, it hurts who you are, like it hurts who you think you could be. There's a couple weird statistics about, we were just discussing Trump's America, as far as, the people that voted for him and believe in, like, for example, his tax bill, which it brings up taxes for people earning less than like $400,000, whatever. And even if you're in that bracket and you voted for Trump, everyone is about to be a millionaire in America. That's like the mentality. It's like, we're all on the precipice. Like, all these people who voted for Trump who are living below the poverty line, but they still believe like, oh, well, I don't belong to that group. I belong to his group. And there's a weird thing in America where we are all, it's the American dream. It's beautiful, but it's this thing of like, none of us belong to the group that is living in that way. We're homeless, but we're homeless we'll be out of here in a second. We don't look at our, it's definitely, I think it's an American way of looking at things. It's like, better days are tomorrow. So why try to fix my problem of today? There's a congresswoman right now, I believe she's in Michigan, Cori Bush, who's incredible. And she has publicly said she was homeless and lived in her car with her 2 children for years. And I think that more stories like that start to emerge are so important. But again, that's that like, oh, well, tomorrow I'll be a congresswoman type of mentality. But at least we have someone who understands what that is like, who can start advocating. But it's very complicated because it is not sexy. It is not something where we can all like parade through the streets and get really excited about. It's something that people want to hide.
There's like these basic ideas of humanity that we understand, like, you need, clean water and electricity, Wi-Fi, like literally legitimate Wi-Fi is
and phones.
And something that should be, like a basic within any form of a shelter.
How can we contribute to the world to actually make it a better place again? Because that's like something that we sort of like all thought about a lot during those times. It's like, what can we do? I think that films like yours or exhibitions like yours, Daniel, can of course contribute because they make aware of certain things that go wrong in our societies. So maybe like, what do you think? Like, what else can we do as a society or an individual as well?
I mean, I think getting that idea of, if you put in the time in a preventive way, if you spend money in the right places early on in, again, like education, but just, making sure that someone gets checked out, for health issues before they show up with a serious condition in the hospital, like that kind of spending really, really hard.
That's on like a macro level though. But like as an individual, it's all really difficult. I just think we need more empathy, like as a
sort
world.
Of blanket situation. There's like just so much nuance, that has to go into these social service programs.
Right.
There's no one
LGBTQ
in New York that's going to be able to handle every single case of homelessness.
Right. Well, it's not something true, but it's also not something that as an individual, like you can't check off in a box. You can't like make a to-do list for that day and be like, oh, I was empathetic. Like, great. It's like, there's no end game. And I think that that's a really tough thing for human beings to kind of accept. Like, there is no finish line for what could be a more compassionate and empathetic life. But I think that, we have biases, prejudices that we carry with us constantly. And to make sure that we're questioning those, we're asking ourselves, like, why am I not meeting this person in the eye as they walk past me who I feel is homeless? Or I don't know, when you give money to a homeless person, what is it to not say like, well, let me buy you a sandwich, but instead just give money? I don't know, but also just like in donating, if you can, in donating to shelters. There's a really great organization in New York called Women in Need, WIN, that does incredible things for homeless families specifically.
It's not just about housing, it's tying it to social services. And so they do a really wonderful job of both providing housing, but then like providing a support network to sort of, help you get to that next chapter in your life, and like the goal is really to get out of, shelter housing.
To become self-sufficient.
Yeah.
So that's a really great organization. I don't know, I think that the more that we can educate ourselves, the better off we'll all be. But for us, in our research, it really comes down to the children. This is a cyclical issue. If you grow up homeless, you will most likely have some bouts of homelessness when you become an adult. So the more that we can combat that with education, the better off I think we'll all be.
Absolutely. Daniel, maybe you want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, as someone representing the museum that I work for, I think that our responsibility, we think, if I had to summarize it, is to put this topic on the table and to find ways of unfolding it and visualizing it and mediating on how to talk about it, if you will. And when we're saying homelessness, architecture, and cities, they're different scales of the same problem, but they exist of course, at the personal level, at the infrastructural level, or at the housing level, if you will, and then at the city level. And at city level, we see more and more cities around the world designing against people being able to sleep in public places with what is called hostile architecture, like subdividing benches or putting spikes on certain places where people lie on the ground. And then the housing crisis, which is probably where architecture has more to say and can contribute more directly, all the way to the personal variables and the multiple reasons which lead people to experience homelessness. It's a problem that happens in many cities around the world, yet it's always particular to each city in different ways. And it's also particular to each individual. So it's very difficult to summarize it. But the aim is to highlight certain issues around the topic, and to also think, how can architecture and how can designers have a say, coordinate other professions around. That's something architecture can do, not only design, but also coordinate and understand how you're responding to clients too. Sometimes we're not focusing on the inventiveness of the design, but on how bold a client is, or an institution that's commissioning, or an organization that administrates, and why they're innovative. So unlike many exhibitions that we do where we're celebrating architecture for maybe a formal capacity or a programmatic capacity, this is more mixed. It's a difficult, it's a very difficult topic to make an exhibition about. But I think you'll judge when we open in November.
Absolutely. And I would even go one step further, and I think that's perfect, probably the perfect ending to our panel discussion here. Is like, I think talking about it as well, and talking about the creative approaches and the films that, well, the specific film that you made, Celine and Logan, and the exhibition that you're curating, and then talking about it, discussing it, and actually making aware of it. So I just want to, on behalf of the Filmfest Munich, I want to thank the three of you to talk about this specific topic and make aware about like homelessness in New York, but then of course in society around the world. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you for having us. So great meeting you, Daniel.
Yeah, congratulations for the film. I hope we can screen it in our museum. We can talk about that further ahead, but congratulations. It's a great accomplishment.
We're excited for your exhibit. It's brave to tell things that have no easy endings, I think, in general, which is what I think hopefully we're all going to keep doing.